Good afternoon, everybody. Congratulations on finding this room. Dr. Witt is trying to sort out the power outage elsewhere on campus, so he's asked me to introduce myself to you. My name is Simon Oliver. I'm Professor of Divinity at Durham University in the UK, and I specialise particularly in Christian philosophical theology and the doctrine of creation. So this is a shameless plug, but I've recently finished a book for Bloomsbury simply called Creation that will be out sometime next year, I hope. My long-term project is concerned with teleology. And teleology, the rejection of it apparently in early modern science and its importance for the theological doctrine of creation and how we understand theological explanation in relation to scientific explanation. So that's my long-term project that's going to be part of a series of lectures, the Stanton Lectures at the University of Cambridge next February and March. I have a very long and happy association with Baylor University, having come several times to give a retreat for the Crane Scholars. So are there any Cranes here this afternoon? So very nice to see you. So I know many of your forebears very well, and so it's wonderful to be back at this beautiful university and to share in what's been a fascinating and very stimulating conference. This afternoon I'm going to talk about theology, science and the purpose of the university, which is a paper that's evolved out of the recent book that I've just finished, and it offers an analysis of the problem but no solutions. So hopefully in our conversation after this presentation we can talk a little bit about where this might lead us, if anywhere. Okay. In the complex world of higher education in the United States, I understand there has long been a discussion about the specifically Christian nature of a university such as Baylor, or the specifically Catholic nature of a university such as Notre Dame. That question certainly just doesn't occur for us in the UK because we have no Christian universities. There is no university in the country that would explicitly describe itself as Christian, although there are plenty that are of Christian provenance, including my own. Durham University was founded by the Bishop of Durham and the Cathedral Chapter in 1832, and in fact I hold a chair that is also connected to a canonry in the cathedral. So I have a post in the church and in the university. Fairly unusual, I think. But the marriage of the church and the university is explicit in the work that I try to do. But this notion of a Christian university doesn't occur for us. Every vice-chancellor in the country would say this university is secular. So for someone coming from the UK, this is an interesting concept. And listening to conversations, trying to work out what it might be to be a Christian university has been fascinating for me over the last few years. There is a sense that being a Christian university ought to make some difference to its curriculum, its goals, its forms of life, beyond merely policies about single-sex dorms or the non-consumption of alcohol, as important as those might be. Beyond the debate about the distinctiveness of a Christian university, what I'd like to argue in this paper is that a university is intrinsically a metaphysical and a theological idea, and that ought to make a real difference. It is to say that a university by its nature and existence asks and answers metaphysical and theological questions, and in the current context they do so very, very badly. Universities are failing to be universities in the proper and original sense of the term, and have become loose configurations of specialist and technical problem solvers whose efforts can only be measured by bland metrics or in terms of rapid, practical and marketable applications in the world of commerce and public policy. To the extent to which the humanities in particular are allowed to remain within the modern university, and certainly their position is very precarious in the UK, an echo, I think, of the original notion of a university as a metaphysical and theological idea remains. My paper this afternoon, exploring this idea of the metaphysical and theological nature of the university, will fall into two halves. First, I'd like to explore what might be meant by saying that the university is a metaphysical and theological idea, and this will involve a brief account of the history of the university from its inception in Paris right at the very beginning of the 13th century, and a brief consideration of John Henry Newman's 1852 lectures, The Idea of a University. I'm going to conclude that theology and metaphysics play the vital role of leavening the discourse of the university, because there are metaphysical and theological foundations and implications to every discourse. Part of our problem, I think, is the apathy towards or rejection of those foundations and implications. So, if you're a philosopher of science and you try and talk to scientists about the philosophical nature of their discipline, you're often talking to a brick wall. It's very, very difficult to try and get that conversation going. The second part of the paper will be a historical study beginning in the 17th century that looks at the origins of the neglect or rejection of metaphysics and theology, just as natural science begins its journey towards cultural and intellectual preeminence in Europe. We'll see that natural philosophy is legitimated by its explicitly theological aims, to strengthen belief in the existence of God and Christian piety. However, the methodological naturalism of this new natural philosophy contained the seeds of the marginalization of theology and metaphysics, because that methodological naturalism is in fact an ontological naturalism that comes to dominate discourse in universities. And ontological naturalism is, of course, a metaphysical claim that needs to be contested. This is not to blame the natural sciences, very far from it. It is to say that the natural sciences invaded a territory that metaphysics and theology had already relinquished, and until the balance is restored, the fragmented and somewhat incoherent nature of the modern research university will, I think, remain. So first to the university as a metaphysical and theological idea. Much of the recent literature on the nature and condition of today's universities points to the character of the first universities in Paris, Oxford and Bologna at the very beginning of the 13th century. These were a development of the monastic schools made possible by a number of social and economic factors in the High Middle Ages, not least the growth of cities. Paris had grown to a population of 25,000 by 1215, and relative political stability. Over time, the influence of the new mendicant orders, the Dominicans and the Franciscans, on the transmission of texts and ideas between different centres of learning through their combination of a religious life with itinerant preaching and teaching also had a very profound effect. By the early 13th century, it had become customary for the canons of Notre Dame to let their houses, that's the cathedral in Paris, not the university in South Bend. By the early 13th century, it had become customary for the canons of Notre Dame to let their houses to masters and students so that a variety of small centres of learning could flourish outside the immediate control of the bishop's chancellor, save for his right to levy a fee on those who'd established their small scholastic communities. And the term universitas eventually came to refer to a legally constituted and self-governing corporation, a guild, much like other guilds, responsible for regulating the behaviour of masters and students, for defending their privileges and appointing masters. The term studium generale referred to an educational body that included more than local students, that appointed multiple masters and could admit students to the higher faculties of theology, medicine and law. Graduates from a studium could in principle teach in other schools without being re-examined. So the idea of a much wider fraternity of scholars with qualifications that traversed borders began to emerge. The first universities were rooted in practical and professional need. The ecclesiastical, governmental and professional requirements of society had to be met by appropriately trained and qualified people. Increasing numbers went in search of a good school that could equip them with skills of rigorous and methodical inquiry, rooted in an environment that was at once rational and devout. The curricula at the new universities were clear: the trivium of grammar, logic and rhetoric, and the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, music and astronomy, leading to the study of philosophy, and then possibly the higher faculties of law, medicine and theology. There was an ordering wisdom with a clear sense of the hierarchy of disciplines and the way in which the lower sciences took their principles from the higher sciences, for example, music taking its principles from arithmetic. And of course, we have a very good account of the ordering of wisdom at the beginning of Aquinas' Summa Theologiae. In time, and despite condemnations by the Bishop of Paris starting in 1210 and continuing sporadically for the next nearly 80 years, the physics and metaphysics of Aristotle gave a clear framework, a conceptual language for teaching and inquiry. Whilst most students exited the university with a qualification that equipped them for a career in administration, law, or perhaps medicine, the basic orientation of all inquiry towards the final end of humanity, as articulated by Christian theology, was clear. In a sense, Christian theology was the governing centre of university teaching and inquiry, yet the ordering of wisdom allowed for the articulation of the proper autonomy of the different disciplines. Now, fast forward 600 years, and skirting around the foundation of the first research university, the state-sponsored University of Berlin, in the early 19th century, and we arrive at the series of lectures given by John Henry Newman in Dublin in May and June 1852 on the establishment of a Catholic university in Ireland. Here we have a slightly different picture of the place of theology and the church within higher learning. Newman saw the role of the university very much in terms of the intellectual formation of its students. An effective university, orientated towards the nurturing of intellectual virtue, will mean that, and I quote, "a habit of mind is formed which lasts through life, of which the attributes are freedom, equitableness, calmness, moderation and wisdom, and good sense, sobriety of thought, reasonableness, candour, self-command, and steadiness of view." I'm sure you recognise all those qualities in yourself and every student you've ever taught. The first line of Newman's The Idea of the University is this: the view taken of a university in these discourses is the following, that it is a place of teaching universal knowledge. Yet the focus of Newman's work seems to be on student formation rather than the details of curriculum content. However, Newton is making a case not simply for a good liberal education, but for the idea of a specifically Catholic university. Theology, specifically Catholic theology, had its critical place within the university. He writes, "Religious doctrine is knowledge, in as full a sense as Newton's doctrine is knowledge. University teaching without theology is simply unphilosophical. Theology has at least as good a right to claim a place there as astronomy." Incidentally, just as a side little anecdote, a very, very good friend and mentor of mine, John Webster, a great Anglican interpreter of Karl Barth, very sadly died at too young an age earlier this year. John was a professor of divinity at Aberdeen University, and they underwent a complete revision of their curriculum a few years ago. And as you can imagine, this created enormous debate and a real fight. And at one point in a big meeting of the University Senate, John stood up and said, "The question is not whether divinity belongs in the university, but whether engineering belongs in a university." As you can imagine, that was a somewhat controversial claim. But I think he probably had a point. Omitting theology, as the proposed Queen's colleges in Ireland sought to do for the sake of religious peace in 19th century Ireland, would not be the omission of just one more subject area amongst others for Newman. Every science would be impoverished by the lack of a proper impact on it of a robust conversation with theology. To include theology makes all the disciplines, and I quote, "not only more Christian, but more philosophical in their construction and larger and deeper in their provisions." So to add theology is not to fill a gap in the curriculum. It's to form and fix the sciences in a circle and a system and give them a centre and an aim. Now, my colleague at Durham, Mike Higton, in his 2012 monograph, The Theology of Higher Education, which is a fabulous book that I commend to you and to which I'm much indebted in the first part of this paper, Mike argues persuasively that Newton's understanding of the place of theology in higher education owes more to his Protestant background and a tendency to separate nature and grace. For Newman, grace steadies nature. It provides nature with a goal and framework within which it can operate. As Higton puts it, Christian faith emerges as a set of guy ropes holding down and holding in shape a tent whose fabric is not itself theological. To give you a sense of how this plays out for Newman, one must realise that he discusses how knowledge and religion, what belongs to nature and what belongs to grace, shape the university. He writes, "Knowledge is one thing, virtue is another. Good sense is not conscience, refinement not humility, nor is largeness and justness of view faith. Intellectual cultivation does not supply religious motives. It is not the cause or proper antecedent of anything supernatural. It is not meritorious of heavenly aid or reward." Unquote. How are knowledge and religion related? Newman states, "Under the shadow indeed of the church, and in its due development, philosophy does service to the cause of morality. But when it is strong enough to have a will of its own, then it does but abet evils to which at first it seemed instinctively opposed. Properly steadied by the church, to use Mike Higton's phrase, higher learning can serve the church's good ends in the perfection of human persons in their intellectual and moral aspects. Outside the influence of the church, university education can have a deleterious effect on its academic officers and students as its sciences become less scientific." Now, Higton argues in some detail for a view of higher education that does not have grace attached to it via the administrations of an external organisation. Rather, he argues that higher learning in any context can be the locus of grace. The university is to be theological all the way down. Higton makes his case by discussing the notion of the virtuous university, the sociable university, the good university, and the negotiable university. He reveals the necessary theological character of those adjectives, virtuous, sociable, good, and negotiable, and paints a very sophisticated picture of university education that makes a positive contribution to societal goods by the communal formation of students and academics. Now, whilst not disagreeing with Higton's suggestions, I'd like to take a slightly different approach to the notion that the idea of a university is a theological and metaphysical idea all the way down, by moving a little closer to Newman, whilst recalling an important characteristic of the medieval universities, particularly Paris and Oxford. The idea of a university began with a conviction that the different modes of human inquiry in the end cohered in a particular kind of unity to create a university. This was reflected in the careful hierarchical ordering of the sciences. They amounted to something that was more than the sum of their parts. The loss of this unity and its consequences, which we can perhaps consider later, is something that we often lament in our own time. We lament the fragmentation of the modern university. 21st century universities are large, complex institutions with multiple stakeholders. Managing such institutions is an incredibly demanding task. Preserving a collective sense of purpose and vision is a key part of the leadership of universities, yet the disciplines that comprise the modern university are so specialised and technical with their particular questions, methods, and traditions of reason and inquiry, that it's very difficult to conceive of any one person who could grasp even a large portion of a university's research activity and grasp it sufficiently well to govern the entire institution, which is why we end up with systems based on metrics, on procedures, on continual audits. I mean, in the UK, this is terrible, the continual auditing of our research through what's called the Research Excellence Framework, where all of our pieces of research, or a sample of them, are given a numerical grading and then correlated with each other so that you can compare the research performance of the Department of Biology in the University of Manchester with the Department of Classics in the University of Exeter. This is the reduction of everything to metrics because of the complexity and difficulty of managing these institutions. So here's Alistair MacIntyre on that very subject. To whom then, in such a university, falls the task of integrating the various disciplines, of considering the bearing of each on the others, and of asking how each contributes to the overall understanding of the nature and order of things? The answer is no one. But even this answer is misleading, for there is no sense in the contemporary American university that there is such a task, that something that matters is being left undone. And so the very notion of the nature and order of things, of a single universe, different aspects of which are objects of inquiry for the various disciplines, but in such a way that each aspect needs to be related to every other, this notion no longer informs the enterprise of the contemporary American university. It makes little difference in this respect whether a university is professedly secular or professedly Catholic. I'd like to suggest that the university is a metaphysical and theological idea in the sense that its fragmentation is itself an implicit metaphysics and theology. The unity of the university was originally a reflection of the unity of the created order and that order's intrinsic reference to God. There was a metaphysics that held the university together. But today we inherit a nominalistic and naturalistic metaphysics that's reflected in our fragmented institutional structures. Here's MacIntyre again. By contrast, the conception of the university presupposed by and embodied in the institutional forms and activities of contemporary research universities is not just one that has nothing much to do with any particular conception of the universe, but one that suggests strongly that there is no such thing as the universe, no whole of which the subject matters studied by the various disciplines are all parts or aspects, but instead just a multifarious set of assorted subject matters. In other words, the fragmented nature of the university is not an accident. MacIntyre suggests, and he's far from unique in this, that the fragmentation of the university is in part due to the fact that a coherent metaphysics, and more particularly the idea of God, are struck off from the list of commitments and the curricula of universities as if they were items at the end of a long list, dispensable in much the same way that, say, political science is dispensable. That's not at all to reject the importance of political science, but metaphysics and theology are just not extra items on the list of disciplines. To sum up, the university is a metaphysical and theological idea in the following sense. Each individual discipline asks about the meaning and implications of its own inquiry and findings. The collection of those disciplines in one corporation poses the question, does the whole amount to something purposeful and meaningful? Metaphysics, because it is concerned with being qua being in its most general sense, concerns itself with the meaning of the particular disciplines and the meaning of the whole in its generality. Theology concerns itself with the meaning of the particular disciplines and the meaning of the whole in relation to God, known by the blending of reason and revelation. To put the matter in Thomist terms, whereas each discipline in the university attempts in principle to say everything about some one thing, history tries to say everything about the past, chemistry about chemicals, and so on and so forth. In principle, it tries to do those things. Theology, in its generality, attempts to say something about everything. It is the generality of metaphysics and theology, the concern with parts and wholes, that makes them the leaven of university discourse. Even if we decide that there is no collective meaning to our various inquiries, that still remains a metaphysical claim that needs to be open to rigorous examination and testing. We may think God dispensable, but that's not metaphysically neutral or a default setting. It needs testing. From where did the idea of the dispensability of God come from? When questions like that are asked, the finger is often pointed at the natural sciences as they nudged other discourses aside, particularly theology, through the latter part of the 19th century. But historically, it is most certainly not the case that the natural sciences have ignored God or dispensed with the idea of God. Quite the reverse. So in the remainder of this paper, I'm going to shift gear somewhat to consider the historical relationship of science and theology in order to shed a little bit of light on our current circumstances in the university. I'll return to my overarching topic in a moment, the intrinsically theological and metaphysical nature of the university. But first, I'm going to take us back to the 17th century and the rise of what became known as physico-theology, the combining of the study of nature with Christian theology. The historian of science Stephen Gaukroger, who now works in Australia, has published 3 of the projected 5 volumes of his comprehensive history of Western science. The first of those volumes, The Emergence of Scientific Culture, covers the period 1210, the beginnings of the Aristotelian condemnations in Paris, up to 1685, just before the publication of Newton's Principia. Gaukroger asks an intriguing question. Why was the practice of natural science consolidated so successfully in the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe, given that advances in the understanding of the natural world had been genuine and widespread, albeit sporadic, in the ancient and medieval worlds? Why did modern science not arise in Arabia or the Far East, where there had been equally strong and successful traditions of natural philosophy? His answer is Christianity. Natural philosophy, broadly speaking the investigation of nature using experiment and mathematics, received legitimation from religion. In 21st century culture, natural science enjoys enormous privilege, including within the university. Scientists speak authoritatively on many matters, including theology. The power of the technological application of science in medicine, computing, manufacturing, and the military is obvious. Scientific research attracts enormous financial investment. The pioneers of modern science, the natural philosophers of the 17th and 18th centuries, enjoyed no such prestige. The purpose of the experimental and mathematical investigation of nature was not at all clear. And the case of one of the greatest scientists of the tradition, Isaac Newton, provides an important example. In 1687, Newton, a fellow at Trinity College, Cambridge, published his great Principia Mathematica. He sent copies to the heads of the colleges of the University of Cambridge, but they did not understand its strange mathematical symbols. The mathematical calculus that Newton deployed seemed to be a mysterious coded language. Specialist mathematicians were employed to tell the readers of the Principia what it meant. This is the first example of popularized science. Moreover, copies of the Principia were rare and expensive. This added to the sense that Newton was a harbinger of divine secrets and a prophet who was unlocking the mind of God. This was certainly how Newton perceived himself, a new Christ who was prophetically returning humanity to a once pristine knowledge of nature last enjoyed by Noah. John Conduit, Newton's biographer, wrote notes on, quote, Newton's suitability for canonization, if not deification, unquote. Conduit, who happened to marry Newton's niece, regarded his subject as, quote, a saint, and his discoveries may well pass for miracles, unquote. Whilst it's now clear that Newton's physics is extremely powerful, we can use it to send a rocket to the moon after all, its purpose was very far from clear in the last decades of the 17th century. In 1692, Richard Bentley, a young clergyman and classicist who delivered the first series of Boyle lectures defending religion from atheism, wrote to Newton to ask about the purpose of his Principia. Newton replied thus, "When I wrote my treatise about our system, I had an eye upon such principles as might work with considering men for the belief of a deity, and nothing can rejoice me more than to find it useful for that purpose." In other words, a central purpose of the Principia, a great work of natural philosophy that today we would call physics, was to support belief in God. By the time of the publication of the second edition of the Principia in 1713, Newton had added a general scholium. Amongst other things, this scholium outlined his theological views and the religious purpose of the treatise. Of God, Newton wrote, "In him all things are contained and move, but he does not act on them, nor they on him. God experiences nothing from the motions of bodies. The bodies feel no resistance from God's omnipresence. We know him only by his properties and attributes and by the wisest and best construction of things in their final causes. And we admire him because of his perfections, but we venerate and worship him because of his dominion." Newton was a prominent figure in the founding of the Royal Society for the improving of natural knowledge, and served as its 12th president from 1703 until his death in 1727. The Royal Society, which flourishes today as one of the world's most prestigious scientific learned societies, was founded in 1660 and received its first royal charter from Charles II in 1662. The second charter, granted a year later, states that the studies of the society were, and I quote, "to be applied to further promoting by the authority of experiments the sciences of natural things and of useful arts, to the glory of God the Creator and the advantage of the human race." And this is reflected in the history of the Royal Society, written in the late 1660s by one of its founders, Thomas Sprat. At a time when the society was in dire financial straits and needed to justify its practices, he wrote, "I now proceed to the weightiest and most solemn part of my undertaking, to make a defence of the Royal Society and this new experimental learning in respect of the Christian faith." At this time, we also find an increasing tendency to see experimental philosophers as priests of nature and revealers of the mysteries of God hidden within the natural order. Robert Boyle, the most remarkable of England's 17th century experimenters, regarded natural philosophy as a way of resolving religious disputes by providing rational empirical evidence. According to Boyle, experiments were best performed on Sundays as part of the wider church's pattern of worship. The discipline of discerning the workings and utility of creatures in order to provide support for belief in God became known as physico-theology, later referred to as natural theology. In the 17th century, natural philosophers with no particular theological training believed they were making significant theological contributions through their experimental observations and their physico-mathematics. In contrast to the relation between theological learning and natural philosophy in the Middle Ages, for example in the work of Thomas, those who practiced physico-theology did not regard metaphysics as mediating between natural philosophy and theology. It therefore claimed to be a more direct and literal application of the reading of nature onto the doctrine of God, with little or no philosophical nuance. What kind of God emerged from this practice of physico-theology, and what kind of creation emerged? The God that emerged was a designer of the universe, who imposed the laws of nature onto passive matter in such a way that the teleology of creation was extrinsic, much as the teleology of a photocopier does not belong to its material parts, but is given by the designer and the operator. So creation comes to be an artifact that stands alongside God. For a more traditional doctrine of creation ex nihilo, it wasn't the case that creation involved there being one thing, God, and then suddenly two things, God plus creation. That's not how the traditional doctrine of creation works. There was only ever one focus of being, God, ens per essentiam, as Aquinas would put it, being through essence, and all that is not God, ens per participationem, being by participation, being that exists only by sharing in God. In the 17th century, an occasionalist doctrine of God emerged that made apparent that the universe could be understood naturalistically, that is, entirely on its own terms, with God added later. How did the method of early modern science lend itself to this kind of naturalism? Well, at the heart of the success of 17th and 18th century natural philosophy lay a method of simplification. Isaac Newton wanted to understand motion more clearly and accurately. So rather than observing the complex motions of creatures within the natural order, he stripped away all context and extraneous factors in order to explore the physics of a single body in the vacuum of absolute space. This was a kind of idealized motion, one that could not pertain in the real world, but allowed a simple but accurate approximation to the real world. Using this method, Newton identified his three laws of motion. From this very simple model, extra factors such as an atmosphere or gravity could gradually be introduced. The model could be developed with increasing layers of complexity until it reached something more proximate to the real world as we encounter it. This method of simplification, of dealing with very complex phenomena within nature by stripping away extraneous factors, is common to the natural sciences, and it's sometimes referred to as abstraction. Processes and entities are reduced to their simplest and most basic parts. Laboratory science is a good and perfectly straightforward example of this method. A process is isolated, removed from a complex context, and observed within a laboratory, a more convoluted and artificial environment. One might examine the human body in a similar way by reducing it to its material parts through dissection or examining its chemical constituents, and this allows us to isolate and treat certain parts of the body that are malfunctioning. Now, the mechanistic physico-theology of the early modern period made such analysis an important part of the way that modern science conceives the world, and this is for two reasons. First of all, the doctrine of creation that emerged from the 17th century conceived of creation as an artifact. For Aristotle, human artistry was subsequent to and reliant upon nature and its intrinsic forms and purposes. Art was understood to imitate nature. This was reversed in modern natural philosophy, as nature comes to imitate art. This meant that just as an artifact can be reduced to its component parts and is nothing more than the amalgamation of those parts, so too creatures were understood as nothing more than the amalgamation of their parts. Secondly, the materialism that came to dominate natural philosophy, the microcorpuscles of the mechanistic ontology, meant that creatures were best analysed not as wholes that were more than the sum of their parts, but in terms of the interaction of their components. Take the example of the unity and wholeness of a clock. It doesn't belong to the materials of the clock itself because they could not organise themselves into the form of a clock. Rather, that form and unity is due to the application of an external design by the clockmaker. Similarly, the structures of creatures came to be understood as lying outside their material natures as the designs of God. Once the modern designer God had been confined to the realms of superstition and myth in the late 19th century, all that was left were assemblages of material components that somehow, we know not how, assemble to form creatures. The scientific method of simplification or abstraction that we find in, for example, Newton's analysis of the motion of a body in a vacuum, or reductivist tendencies of mechanical philosophy, has given rise to an important distinction in recent discussions of the relationship between science and theology, a distinction between methodological naturalism and ontological naturalism. Naturalism is a complex label in contemporary philosophy, but is, very broadly speaking, the idea that the natural world is all there is. There is nothing beyond nature as we encounter it. There is no supernatural or transcendent realm. Very often this is allied to materialism, the view that every event in the universe, including emotions, thoughts, intention and causation, is a material event. Methodological naturalism is the idea that science proceeds as if material nature is all there is. In other words, the scientific method of abstraction and reduction is simply that, a method. It brackets theology and the supernatural, it lays them to one side, and examines material nature. It remains neutral concerning metaphysics and theology. Put simply, methodological naturalism makes no fundamental claims about what exists. It simply examines a particular part of reality composed of material nature using experimental observation and mathematical analysis. For some scientists, this way of preserving science's proper autonomy from metaphysics this is one way of preserving science's proper autonomy from metaphysics and theology. God can be put to one side, the natural world can be investigated, and God can be reintroduced at a later stage if one wishes. Ontological naturalism, on the other hand, is more full-blooded. It is a claim about what there is. For the ontological naturalist, material nature exhausts reality. There is nothing more. Ontological naturalists in this sense are perforce atheists. Whilst many scientists, philosophers and theologians are not ontological naturalists, many are methodological naturalists. In claiming that naturalism is an appropriate method for science, methodological naturalism apparently allows science to get on with its business of examining the natural world, whilst metaphysics and theology get on with their own separate business. Within this approach is the claim that the reductive method of science, the reduction of natural processes and entities to their component parts, and their investigation via experiment and mathematical analysis, is theologically and philosophically neutral. This leads to what Michael Hamby, formerly of this university, now at the John Paul II Institute in Washington, this leads to what Michael Hamby calls an extrinsicist understanding of the relationship between science, metaphysics and theology. These disciplines are extrinsic to each other, having nothing to do with each other because of their differing methods and domains. Hamby argues, however, that methodological naturalism is very far from neutral. The method of science always masks an ontological naturalism. In other words, the way one investigates nature scientifically, the method, already contains within itself a particular view of what nature is, the ontology. At a basic level, this, I think, makes sense. When one investigates something, for example, the nature of the human person, the way one investigates it will be moulded very much by what it is one thinks one is investigating. What one looks for will be determined by what one thinks is there to be seen. The way one investigates natural phenomena will very much determine what one sees and, crucially, what one does not see. Modern science claims to place before us the world as the world really is in itself, and by its method to render nature transparent to our gaze. Its method is neutral and simply presents the literal facts. Expressed all too briefly, here's one reason why that claim might be brought into question. We should recall that the method of science as it emerged in the 17th century included a particular view concerning the nature of explanation. For Francis Bacon, proper scientific explanation of nature was understood to refer only to efficient causes and not to final causes or purposes. This is partly because final causes, purpose and intention, were deemed to belong exclusively to the human domain and by extension to God. What distinguished humans from wider nature, including animals, was purpose. Non-human nature was not intrinsically purposeful. But by adopting a method that refers only to efficient causes, the world that was observed by natural science was unsurprisingly found to be purposeless and mechanical. The decision to discount teleology, however, was arguably not one that arose from the empirical observation of the world. It arose from an ontological decision concerning what the world is, a mechanism composed of parts that interact by efficient causes. It's often claimed that science observes no purpose in nature because purpose is not there to be seen. But this jars with our basic intuitions and descriptions of the natural world. Biological accounts of this natural world have struggled for 200 years to rid themselves of teleological descriptions of living organisms. In answer to the question, why does the heart beat, it proves immensely difficult to discount as untrue or trivial the statement in order to pump blood around the body. Yet this is not a mechanical or efficient causal explanation. It's an explanation that refers to purpose, in order to pump blood around the body. Similarly, it's difficult to describe the immune system without referring to the purpose of restoring health. Some scientists will claim that there is a difference between explanation, which must always be in terms of efficient causes, and mere description. An efficient causal explanation of why the heart beats will refer to neurology and electrical impulses in the heart. We might describe the heart as beating in order to pump blood, but this is not a scientific explanation and is really just metaphorical. This, however, generates a problematic division between the way we explain the world scientifically, and therefore what science permits us to see, and the way we perceive and describe the world at a more basic, intuitive and common sense level. The fact that the sciences, particularly the life sciences, have failed to purge themselves of teleological descriptions perhaps indicates that there is more to be seen of nature than the mechanical and efficient causal processes that are given in their explanations. In other words, it may be the very method of science, governed by a priori judgments concerning what the world is, that generates a failure to see purpose in nature. One further aspect of the relationship between science and theology is particularly pertinent with respect to the doctrine of creation. This is that methodological naturalism, in bracketing God and the supernatural, cannot in fact make a neutral and indifferent decision concerning what counts as nature and how it relates to God. Michael Hamby puts this point in the following way. More simply, science is intrinsically related to theology because one cannot identify the object of scientific inquiry, namely nature, without simultaneously distinguishing it from that which is not nature, namely God, and without giving tacit specification to the character of this not. Conceptions of nature determine in advance what sort of God is allowed to appear to thought, and consequently the range of meanings that can be intelligibly attached to creation. Contrast the methodological naturalism of modern science with the Thomist doctrine of creation that identifies the world first and foremost as created, specifies the nature of its relation to that which is uncreated, and then proceeds to examine the world on that basis. In other words, the meaning of creation and the world as created was specified at the beginning as the first thing that must be said. In the rise of physico-theology in the 17th century, although at first glance it looks like theology and natural philosophy remain close companions, the procedure is quite different. A particular conception of the world, one of mechanical causes and microcorpuscles, was distinguished from an entirely separate supernatural realm with no prior discussion of the meaning of creation and no identification of the natural realm in terms of a relation to that which is supernatural. Having established the nature of the world without recourse to theology, a God was introduced and placed alongside the world on the only basis that offered hope of intelligibility, given the way that the world had already been understood, as a designer akin to the human designer of an artifact. The implication is that unless we say first and foremost that the world is created and understand what that claim means and what it does not mean, the God who emerges from science will be defined by the prior identification of the world as a self-standing object. Bringing theology and science back into intelligible and deep conversation is then much more difficult, demanding more than appeals to happy coincidences between science and theology and vague expressions of shared awe and wonder that betoken a creator. It is difficult but by no means impossible. It requires, however, an examination of the metaphysical and theological decisions that underlie the undeniably staggering success of the modern natural sciences. There may be aspects of the world that we do not see because we do not first and foremost, before all else, identify the world as created. In concluding this paper, I must stress that it would be a misunderstanding to hear me as blaming the natural sciences and their preeminence for the fragmentation and incoherence of the contemporary university. By the time natural science came to prominence in the 17th century, theology and metaphysics, I think, had already relinquished their proper responsibilities. Changes in the understanding of how creation relates to God and the failure to articulate adequately the difference between primary and secondary causation had opened up a territory that natural philosophy could invade and occupy. In an essay entitled God, Philosophy, Universities, Alistair MacIntyre points out that not only is the contemporary university fragmented, but so too is one of the key sciences, philosophy, that was traditionally charged with articulating the university's unity and purpose. MacIntyre writes, "The fragmentation of inquiry and the fragmentation of understanding are taken for granted, so that if philosophy is to put them in question, as any theistic philosophy must, it must not only engage in distinctively different types of inquiry, but provide those inquiries so far as it can with a different type of academic setting. If the modern university is to be anything more than a loose configuration of highly specialised modes of inquiry orientated towards utilitarian ends, it needs to realise that it is intrinsically a theological and metaphysical idea, so that theology and philosophy are not extra items on the curriculum list. They are the leaven of human discourse that lift us beyond the merely particular to consider also, as far as we can, the whole and its reference to the supernatural. What's not possible, I've argued, is indifference or neutrality with respect to such questions, because this kind of methodological naturalism results in an ontological naturalism that is inadequate to the subject matters of university discourses. Until the metaphysical and theological implications of the way we conceive the university are brought to the surface, we will continue to find these institutions unified by merely pragmatic concerns, recruitment targets, the need to rise up league tables and wring more money out of the alumni. In short, the coherence and unity of the university really does depend on a proper metaphysics and theology, and that is the responsibility of the philosophers and the theologians, not the scientists. Thank you very much indeed for your patience. So I guess we now have, not quite sure how much time, we've got about half an hour or so, I think, for questions and conversation. So it's over to you. And me having spoken for nearly an hour, far too long. If there's anyone who could find me a cup of water, that would be really, really, really kind. Thanks, Aaron, very much. So, so over to you, really, if you'd like to comment or question. Sorry.
I'm not quite sure how to ask this question, but I'm wondering, the way you presented, almost as if you have to make a decision from the start about the createdness of the world. I'm wondering if you see the possibility of any sort of mediating stages there. For instance, that's maybe not the first question, but maybe the first question has to do with us and whether we have a spiritual dimension or
I think
mediating questions that don't put that at the forefront immediately, because I mean there have been conceptions of God's relation to the world that are not creation in a strict sense, such as Aristotle or Plotinus or something like that. So I'm wondering if it's right to think about the way we approach the question of createdness might actually have to be mediated through questions that first pertain to ourselves and the possibility of seeing transcendent, a certain sort of transcendent reality within the world itself.
Yeah. Oh, that's helpful. I don't think I'm suggesting anything as crude or black and white as you've got to decide whether you're confessional or not, or anything like that. I think what I'm suggesting is Well, first and foremost, that the fragmented nature of the university is not an accident. I think that's the first thing. And it's not simply a result of the complexification of the modern world. And it implicitly sort of hides under the surface a certain kind of metaphysical claim. And it may be that we decide, yeah, naturalism's true. But what I'm suggesting is that that's a contestable claim, and we really ought to work that out first. Then, that may help us in a slightly different and more intelligible way to work out what on earth a university is for and what it's not for. So I think really what I'm saying is I agree with you. I think that the point is that metaphysics is not something that it's not another item on the curriculum list. Every scientist really ought to be thinking about the metaphysical implications of what they're doing, and some scientists do. Simon Conway Morris, who's professor of paleobiology at Cambridge, he's very clear about what the metaphysical implications are of his idea of convergence, and he hands that over to the philosophers and discusses it with them. And that kind of enterprise, I think, is really quite a good one, and one that happens very, very rarely. So what Simon will say about philosophy of science and its relationship to what scientists do is that the scientists just ignore it completely. And there doesn't seem to be any space in the modern university to open up that conversation properly. And it's not a question of turning scientists into philosophers. It's looking at the fact that you can think about the meaning of a particular area of a university's inquiry, and at the end of the day you are, whether you like it or not, going to butt up against a question of whether the whole makes any sense, and that's a theological question, I think. So I think when I say, get creation straight, I think what I mean by that is not necessarily everyone adopt creation ex nihilo, but think about whether the reality that science explores is exhaustive. Is it all there is? And therefore I think you're then into a discussion about a better discussion about the proper place of the natural sciences, and what Michael Hamby would say, it makes science proper science. I mean, the title of his book is No God, No Science, ? It will help us to see what we don't see. And I think one of the big problems of natural science is that we pretend that it simply reveals the world as it is in all its fullness exhaustively. That's the ontological naturalism. And I think at an intuitive level, that's just, that should bring us up short. But saying it reveals the world exhaustively to us is part and parcel of science's preeminence. It's part and parcel of the very prestigious place it holds within our intellectual life and within public discourse. So the question is, can it be better placed, I suppose?
Yeah, maybe I'm wondering about whether we need to think about when the question of God ought to come in appropriately, because at least in the medieval debates, you have to defend the fact that there is a science called metaphysics.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not that.
Of course.
So that has to be, in some ways, that's
absolutely
more in the
yeah.
analysis of man.
Yeah.
Or the human nature rather than immediately the question.
I mean, we're starting from such a completely different place, which is why, I really don't want to be nostalgic about this and say we just rewind the tape to 1200 and the University of Paris and we simply start from Sacra Doctrina. Of course, we can't do that. The question is, where do we insert the metaphysics and the theology that overlaps it, really? That really is the issue, I think. Yes, sir.
I had a question. I was going to start with a historical kind of observation and then move to a broader conceptual question about the possibility of theology. And I take this to be kind of your normative suggestion that theology / philosophy, which is obviously conceptually a big slash.
Yeah.
And I did that. As providing some sort of unity, right? That the contemporary university needs
It's asking the question of whether there is one.
Okay, well, so asking the question or presuming that a unity could hold together a university. Because my question is this. When I think of the history of universities, especially the medieval university, I think of agonism. I think of the disputation in which metaphysics actually was a celebration of agonistic non-consensus, right?
Yeah.
And then so that's the disputation as this
Yeah.
kind of ritual practice speech act of this consensus that didn't really provide a unified account of the universe, much less of the institution in which people were
Yep.
learning. So fast forward to the early 18th century, the founding of the University of Göttingen in 1734, in which the elector of Hanover decided that he was going to take away the right of the theology faculty of censorship. Right? So for the first time in history, a university was going to deny the theology faculty the right granted by the king to censor other faculty members, namely philosophers.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And they did that for the sake of unity. Right? That was the argument,
Yeah.
right? Because this is, President Wolf had just been expelled from the University of Halle. Halle had been torn apart between pietist theologians,
Yep.
More Calvinist Reformed theologians, and more standard kind of Lutheran reformers, right?
Yep.
So it was precisely the history of since Paris up to early 18th century. It was the theologians. This was the claim,
Yeah.
who had actually torn asunder the
Yeah.
university.
Yeah.
Kant laments this, as you know, in
Yeah.
all of his prefaces to
Yeah.
the revisions, an introduction to the first critique. He calls it the wasteland of metaphysics, which is
Yeah.
torn us asunder. And so it was precisely theology that had to be put into its place in order to provide for unity, and that of course gives rise to a modern university in which what they call Polizeiwissenschaft, so
Yep.
kind of an early mercantilism
Yep.
is given a private place. And so my question is, well, aren't you being nostalgic, right? I mean,
Yep.
wasn't it actually the metaphysicians and the theologians, at least
Yep.
historically, who did,
Yep.
tear apart the university?
Okay, so so a few things about that. I mean, that picture is exactly replicated in 19th century Ireland. So the Queen's colleges were founded, leaving theology aside, because of the history of religion in Ireland. So this is a long story. I think what I'm suggesting is that that theology and metaphysics are not there to provide a unity in the sense that everyone agrees. So it's not a kind of voluntaristic unity in that sense. It's more a unity of purpose. So a sense that the particular questions that are asked in particular departments will always lead to a question, which is, do the parts refer to something, to a universe? Is there a universe? So it's not so much the providing of answers as the posing of a question, and the proper posing of a question, and the provision of the means of deciding it. Now, of course, that leads to considerable division and disputation, but that's because we're dealing with things at the very edges of our understanding of our language.
But then could it be kind of cheeky and then say, well, it's actually the university you want is the university that Kant imagined in 1798 with the conflict of the faculties, which was only which was the possibility of the various disciplines actually debating these questions in a space set apart from the state, which of course theology was necessarily deposed in that conflict, kind of various tradition competing institution.
So I don't think that's the picture I've got in my mind. I think
I didn't imagine, but
no, sure. I mean, I think the picture I've got in my mind is not okay. I think the point is that the way that we set up the university now, the disciplines do compete with each other for pride of place, and they invade each other's territory all the time. So, for example, Richard Dawkins, a biologist, I'm sorry I'm taking the most crude example, but it's the most obvious one that comes to mind.
Fair. He's a caricature.
Well, I know it's a caricature. I know it's a but this is okay. Take any reductive account of religion, for example. Yeah. Now this is psychology or biology going into a domain of metaphysics and theology, because there is a vacuum there. Because those things are then contestable. And what you do get then is a kind of conflict. I think there is a sort of an underlying simmering conflict in the modern university about who's going to get the next building for the next grant for the biggest building, and who's going to recruit the most number of students, because which discipline really tells us how it is, which is reducible to which discipline is the most useful. But I think what I'm suggesting is that there is a place for metaphysics and theology that allows those questions to be asked in a much better way than they are asked now, and helps us to point out what the metaphysical implications are to a supposedly neutral form of discourse. And what I'm suggesting is that there is no metaphysically neutral form of discourse. So what I'm not suggesting is that there's going to be an outbreak of peace in the university. Nothing could be worse, actually. But I think improving the quality of our disagreements will be a better way of putting it. Sorry, so I go here and then David. Is that okay?
In a project to decide if naturalism is an accurate description of the universe,
Yeah.
are you suggesting that methodological naturalism is not a helpful term?
Yeah, because it turns out to be an ontological naturalism. So the methodological naturalism will park the idea of God and the metaphysical implications of or foundations of what we're doing, and we'll simply observe the world, and then what happens is you bring God back in. And that is how a lot of the discourse around science and religion works today. So the God who then gets reintroduced turns out to be a God who stands alongside another object called the world. And theologically that becomes very problematic. You end up with a God that no one really can believe in. This is Michael Buckley's point in The Origins of Modern Atheism. No one believes in the God of modernity.
Could I follow up?
Sure.
Why do you suppose so many Christian theologians and Christians in the sciences have embraced that term? Well, created the term. Came out of Wheaton in the late 70s, early 80s. Why has it been such an attractive term?
Because
does it give standing, intellectual standing?
Well, it's because it allows it allows an autonomy to the discipline of science. You get on with your business, leaving God to one side, and it's part of. It's perfectly understandable because it's part of this business of abstraction. So if you want to examine how the kettle boils the water for your coffee in the morning, you don't start with the question, God created the kettle. You've got to strip out a whole load of stuff to simplify and observe a process or whatever. But I think what I'm asking is, that the method as a whole, what underlies the decision concerning what's left out and what's still included, what's observed, what's not observed, what is it you're observing. So part of the claim was that the God that was put to one side in the 17th century was a God that was put to one side of a universe that had already been understood with a particular kind of metaphysics and theology, which was essentially a mechanistic ontology that actually has survived in the common imagination with incredible resilience. But they knew almost immediately it didn't work. A mechanistic ontology doesn't work because it doesn't explain life properly, and it doesn't explain all kinds of phenomena, like the burning of a log on the fire, because any mechanistic process ought to be reversible. And there are all kinds of non-reversible phenomena in nature. So they kind of knew it didn't work, but it continued in the modern imagination. So the God who then gets reintroduced is a mechanic. And you get a kind of occasionalism that the happenings in the world are simply the occasion for the demonstration of divine power. And that, I think, is a God that none of us can really believe in. So Anyway, I'll move on to David. Yeah.
So, thank you, first of all, for a great paper, and I'm with you most of the way, but I have two questions. One is a sort of follow-up to the last three questions, and the other is a whole different kettle of fish. The follow-up is, isn't the reason for the methodological naturalism in the first place less about, I mean, whatever its original historical motivations, the kind of perpetuation of it in the modern era, in the contemporary era, not so much about the need for abstraction or simplification of problems, but a real certainty on the part of the natural scientist that those philosophical and metaphysical questions are ultimately undecidable. And therefore, it really doesn't matter whether you step out of your scientific methodology for long enough to have that conversation, because it's never going to be resolved from the scientist's point of view. So Richard Dawkins comes out and says a bunch of nonsense about religion, and then Nicholas Lash steps up, or Rowan Williams steps up and says this is all nonsense, and here's what a real theologian thinks about it. And you can put all those equations on the board, and everybody says, I'm still where I was before, and the other person said, right? And so that undecidability seems to me one of the chief factors that's keeping this conversation from happening from the point of view of the disciplinary guilds that you're describing. So that, I'd kind of like to get your sense of that and sort of follow up with these questions that have been asked. The other kettle of fish is, the fragmentation that you speak of is a problem, but it's also one of the virtues of the university in this sense, that and that it has allowed a lot more conversations to take place than could ever take place under a more unified version of the university.
Yep.
And so we've heard a lot more voices in the last few decades and century than we ever would have under previous conceptions of the university. Now, I know you're not arguing for a nostalgia, but when you close with somebody like the person who at this conference we could refer to as St. Alistair McIntyre, speaking of the fragmentation of philosophy, right? I like a lot about McIntyre, but I don't want his version of philosophy, because he thinks a lot of voices are just crazy that I think we need to hear. So I'm a little worried about the person who kind of just says, well, philosophy is fragmented, and unless it gets its act back together, we won't really have a coherent conception of anything, because that just sounds like silencing a lot of voices, ultimately.
Can I start with that issue first and then go? So I completely agree, David, that there have been massive advantages to the division of labour. It's as simple as that. We've broken down problems, and we've gone at them in extremely specialised ways. So as you say, I'm not after a nostalgia and getting rid of that. I simply want the one as well as the many. So, philosophy may well have become fragmented and into highly technical disciplinary areas, logic and so on and so forth. And I think one thing I do worry about, to be honest, is philosophy's attempted alliance with the natural sciences in the 20th century. I think that's it was deeply problematic, and that was a rejection of its own distinction and its own proper questions and methods. And it saw that as the only way of legitimising itself. And I think that's a lot of what lies behind what McIntyre is saying. But I think what I'm pointing to is the division of labour has been enormously successful. But it does mean that there are questions that are very, very difficult even to frame and ask because of that division. And I think one of them is the question that Candice Vogler was asking last night, which is the nature of a common good, for example. So how does a common good arise from the particular goods of each of these disciplines? And so what I would have thought we need is not to get rid of the division and the difference, but find some way of asking intelligibly the question, does it amount to a whole that's more than the sum of its parts?
Yeah, but you're referring to it as division of labor, and I didn't use that term. Okay. I'm really thinking more about people who said, we have to run this whole project differently because there's not space for the way we think within this unified form. So to take McIntyre's critique at the end, the reason for Derridian deconstruction, the reason for Foucault's genealogy is that it is a breaking out of a world that said you can't do that kind of thing in philosophy.
Right.
And so there's a kind of attempt to, I don't think so much divide labor, but to kind of blow apart the conception of unity that had previously existed.
Okay, right.
Perhaps in order to reform it in some other way,
Yeah.
but it's probably going to be a more diversified unity than appeared to be the case before,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. No, I completely agree that it's a unity that is not a uniformity. No, I mean, I don't want to collapse the differences between the disciplines. What I do want is a more proper and intelligible account of their differences, and of how they relate to each other and support each other or don't support each other,
As
the
opposed
case
to
may
people
be.
just going off in their various
Absolutely,
schools.
yeah,
and kind of doing
absolutely.
their thing, right?
So
Yeah.
at the moment, what we've got is quite informal and sporadic attempts to do this in what we're all pushed to do, which is interdisciplinary discourse.
Mhm.
But it's interdisciplinary discourse that's got no kind of intelligible basis to it, because we haven't actually talked about what that means or doesn't mean. And at the moment, what interdisciplinary discourse means is that we happen to find happy coincidences between things. That's science and religion. And I just don't think that really works at a philosophical level, which is why all that stuff continues to be very sporadic and doesn't really take root. It's just, you just happen to get a friend, a guy in chemistry who's a friend of a guy in theology.
Right, exactly.
So I think it's certainly a different kind of unity that preserves and makes more intelligible the diversity, that's for sure. So in that sense, I'm not going back to the medieval consensus.
Right.
Yep, now that's a very different kind of, because the medieval consensus was that kind of Aristotelian imposed unity. Going back to the other business about undecidability, and keeping the conversation going, I'm going to have to think a bit more about that. I think that the way that the natural sciences quite rightly operate is in terms of questions that are decidable given the methods they've already got. Okay, so a question becomes undecidable when it simply is not answerable by a particular scientific method. So, and where you get a kind of a revolution in Thomas Kuhn's sense is when you get a change of method that opens up a whole new vista of questions. Now, I think what I'm suggesting is that there are a whole bunch of questions that are not submittable to a scientific method and are therefore on science's terms undecidable, but that doesn't render them illegitimate questions as a result. So I think that debate will continue going, but its undecidability doesn't count against it, I don't think. I think it's...
Right, and I agree, and you don't have to convince me of that, but you may have to convince some natural
Yeah,
scientists.
absolutely. No, I can... But, I mean, one quite good example of this recently was Thomas Nagel's book,
Yeah.
Mind and Cosmos.
Right.
Now, the response to that book was almost hysterical
Yeah,
in certain
right,
quarters,
yeah.
particularly amongst philosophers of science,
Yeah.
who just saw a kind of theistic metaphysics lying behind this, which of course is not his intention at
Right.
all. But what he was saying is that, the way that science is conceiving the world at the moment, and particularly its weddedness to evolutionary biology, just means there are a whole bunch of questions that on those terms are not answerable, are not askable.
But even the title of the book has the phrase "almost certainly false."
Almost certainly false. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
He
absolutely.
still wants to be a natural scientist.
Yeah, absolutely. But he was asking a whole set of questions, saying,
Yeah.
on the terms of science as it's currently conceived, we
Yeah,
just can't
yeah.
get any further forward.
Agreed.
And anyone? Okay, right. I'm being told by James to wrap it up. Thanks so much for your patience and your questions. That's been really very good.